For this lecture, I'm going to drop my usual mask of cool, scientific, dispassionate, value-free science, because I happen to be hopping mad, and the thing which makes me hopping mad, well, there are two conditions for making me hopping mad. One is that a monstrous injustice is being done, and which is almost always, in fact, I can't think of any other counterexamples, almost always by the government. And secondly, that everybody's in favor of it. In other words, no voice, at least no voice that I read or hear, comes out against it. So these two, no voice comes out against it. So these two conditions being fulfilled, that's when I sort of get activated. My anger glands, as it would be, like and the little Abner sort of thing, start getting moving high speed. Well, it so happens the last two things that have activated my anger glands have been both connected with a topic for tonight, which is basically price controls and its attendant evils. The last time was August 15th, the black day of August 15, 1971, when President Nixon reimposed price controls for the first time since the Korean War, and really basically for the first time since World War II. So that means the first time in, quote, peacetime, unquote. After many years of saying, and he and all of his economic advisors put together, saying time and again that they will never impose controls because it wouldn't work, and it's terrible, and it interferes with free enterprise, and so forth. So that was, and since then we've had many phases, some of which I'll talk about, none of which have worked. Phase 1, 2, 3, 3.5, and 4. And now we have the final sort of conclusion of this, the price control, which those of us who are free market economists have predicted for many years that after price control come shortages. And so, of course, we have shortages all around us now, all over the place. And after shortages come rationing, and that was sort of the icing on the cake. And the thing that's got me hopping mad now, of course, is the announcement of imminent gasoline and fuel rationing. And as the announcement came pouring off the presses, as President Nixon made his announcement on the subject, for some incredible reason, which really, to understand it, I think you need a psychopathologist rather than an economist. For some reason, this buoyed up his credibility, which had reached about zero, or minus something, the president's credibility, and it rallied the disenchanted masses of Americans to the Nixon banner. The fact that he gets on television and tells everybody they have to tighten their belt and suffer and stop using electricity and turn down the heat and stop using gasoline and all the rest of it. For some reason, this sort of pronouncement activates the siege mentality, which is somewhere in the American psyche, and everybody says, yes, we have to rally behind the cause. It's a great strong statement to make, and yes, sir, we got to tighten our belts. Of course, now we're in the sphere of phase 1 of belt tightening is always the voluntary belt tightening. That's when everybody says that you and him go out there and tighten your belts, and that of course never works. I mean, it's done with a great deal of enthusiasm, the voluntary belt tightening, and you and him turn down the heat. Some enterprising reporters the day after the Nixon statement went to the White House and several other federal buildings and to the thermometer and checked on it, found out that the thermometer, the temperature ranged from 71 to 74, that the austere 68 degrees had not been imposed yet. And so, of course, the typical of the White House is their comeback to this was, well, it takes several days for the thermostat to move, change the temperature. So you and him go out there and sacrifice. That's sort of the phase 1. And phase 2 is, of course, when this doesn't work, and then you turn to the coercive arm of the government to make sure that everybody sacrifices and everybody's supposed to shape up. And usually with the coercive arm, everybody says, yes, you're right, voluntary methods don't work, so we have to move on to coercion. And of course, we're in the process of moving on to coercion already. Well, this sort of ties in a little bit with the Galbraith stuff, the attack on affluence I was talking about last week. And I'm going to get back to the whole conservation movement later on, after we talk about capital, and we start talking about private property and capital, because the conservation movement, the environmental movement in general, is the old joke, or the current joke, just about my second favorite movement. what my first favorite movement is, I don't know, it'd be something like Genghis Khan or something, restoration of the Habsburgs, something like that. And it ties in with the attitude, and this I think ties in with everybody's willingness to belt tighten, or at least proclaim willingness to belt tighten. It ties in with the attack on not only affluence, but attack on comfort, on consumption, on any sort of really human survival above the bare subsistence, primitive subsistence level. In other words, it's really attack on man, period. And if you think this is overdrawn, attack on human beings, period. If you think this is overdrawn, I'm going to get back to that theme later. If you think this is overdrawn, read some of the conservation movement literature. It's an instructive. Some years ago, I had to. It was part of my job to read some of it. And it was an instructive lesson because what really animates the conservationists, the environmentalist movement, is they're not really worried about sulfur dioxide and that sort of stuff. This stuff is only grist to the mill. It's something that's latched onto. What they're really against are people, because they're always talking about man the destroyer, man the garbage can, and that sort of stuff, man the polluter, man the evil whatever. And the theme is basically that nature, before man existed, everything was great. Everything was terrific. Nature was harmonious and balanced, and ecologically, the animals were eating each other to the proper optimum, and all that, and the plants were whatever the plants do, and everything was going great, and it was a circular world, as they like to put it. In other words, the planets went around the sun, and everything was sort of balanced. Nothing much happened. Obviously, it was a pretty boring world, but we didn't have to worry about it because there were no people anyway. The concept of boredom doesn't even come into the picture. So it was a circular world. Everybody was sort of happy and contented, and the beaver was doing its beavering and all that. And then into this pleasant and happy, ecologically balanced picture, people enter. Evil man enters the picture, and evil man is entering the picture, not having any instincts, not working within the given environment, not bound by the temperature of wherever he happens to be born in, moving around, changing the environment, chopping down trees, catching fish and all the other stuff, altering the environment in a linear manner. In other words, a manner of progress. Let's put it that way. I'm going to use the old-fashioned word, which is now out of fashion. So the man progresses from the caveman, from dying at the age of 21 or whatever, builds stuff, builds factories, increases the standard of living, builds capital equipment, builds medical techniques and all the rest of it, and survives and prospers and flourishes. And this is a linear thing. By doing that, the beaver tend to die out, and the trees are chopped down. All the fish are fished, and all the other terrible things that happen to the other species. And I confess, right here, I have a value judgment. I am a human chauvinist. In other words, if there's a choice in the old lifeboat between people and caribou, I'll go for the people any time. And I think it's, let me put it this way, I think it's rather bizarre to take the other position. That if there's a choice between the people and the caribou in the old lifeboat, you dump the people and you bring in the caribou. But I really think that this is the guts of the gut core of the environmentalist movement. And so anytime there's any kind of a clash between the interests of human beings on one hand, and the interests of trees, plants, fish, caribou, aesthetics, in other words, the landscape, on the other hand, people are always supposed to lose out. And this is, of course, very relevant to the energy crisis, which I'm going to hope to talk about tonight anyway. Getting down to the price control thing, this was a topic which up until a couple of years ago, up until two years ago, the topic of price control was the sort of thing I told students, and it was sort of like the old Neanderthal days. I give them stories about how back in the old days of World War II, of course none of the kids remember World War II, back in the old days of World War II there was price control, there was something called the OPA, and there was rationing, everybody lined up around the block and you couldn't find anything. And I told all the horror stories that was going on there. And they'd sit there gaping, and to them it was just about as relevant as when I talk about ancient Rome and how the same thing happened then. But so it was a sort of a Neanderthal type thing. It was supposed to be sort of an antiquarian story about what happens when you have price control and rationing. Unfortunately, antiquarianism is now very relevant, directly coming up And we're back in the old business. It's one of the interesting things about studying history, by the way, is that you see the same old junk is going on 100 years ago, 20 years ago, 1,000 years ago, as is going on now. And this, I suppose, equips you to deal with it. You get a certain perspective. At any rate, the theory of price controls is fairly clear and fairly simple. And as far as I know, it's not really contested by anybody. Even the economists who don't say anything or favor price controls when they come in. Basically, going now to figure 5, we have our supply and demand curve for any product, prices on the y-axis, and the quantity purchased on the x-axis. The falling demand curve and the rising supply curve, or it could be a vertical supply line in the short run. Equilibrium point at the intersection, equilibrium price. And as you remember, there's a sort of a feedback arrangement, a built-in feedback arrangement in the free market, so that any temporary shortage is eliminated because the price rises, and any temporary surplus is eliminated very quickly because the price falls to the equilibrium free market level, where demand is equal to supply, where the market is cleared. So then what happens if some outside agency, namely the government, there's really no other, it's possible this could be done voluntarily by businesses, but it's very unlikely. An outside agency using coercion, namely the government, steps in and prevents this process from working. In other words, prevents the market from reaching the equilibrium point. Well, let's take the above market price. Say that we have a price above the market, which the government says, "Thou shalt not sell below X amount." And if you think this is rare, it isn't. I'll get to in a minute. So the government says, enforces a minimum price floor, minimum price control above presumably it's above the free market price. If it's below the free market price, it doesn't matter. I mean, in other words, if somebody says, the government passes an edict saying, "Thou shalt not," to General Motors, "Thou shalt not sell Cadillacs for less than $500, new Cadillacs," it's not going to make an imprint on the market. It's going to be sort of a dead letter law. If on the other, so the only relevant edict is minimum price control is above the market. Indeed, there's no point in issuing the other one. So if you have a minimum price control above the market, you have a line, a horizontal line above the equilibrium price. What happens? What happens is that at that minimum price, the public will only buy this much up to the A, up to point A, but pouring out on the market in response to this high price is the amount B, which is much greater. So we now have an unsold surplus, a gap between A and B, which the market doesn't, unless you engage in black market or illegal activity, which is rather rare with a floor, minimum price. The government is now, by outside coercion, is preventing this natural equilibrating process from taking place. So what you have then is a situation of a permanent unsold surplus. You're sitting there then with the government saying, "Okay, thou shalt not sell widgets for below $10 a case, or thou shalt not sell soybeans for below X dollars a bushel," or whatever. So what happens then is that you have this unsold surplus which somehow sits there aggravating the situation. Something has to be done about it. The most famous example of the unsold surplus. Well, let me finish the theory before getting to that. So in other words, the minimum price control brings about a permanent, aggravated, chronic, miserable, unsold surplus. What happens when the price is set below the free market price? In other words, when you have a maximum price control below the free market. Again, a maximum price control above the free market price would be meaningless. So in this situation, when the price is set below the free market price, the government saying, "Thou shalt not sell Cadillacs for more than $500, a new Cadillac," then you have some trouble. And the opposite kind of trouble. Then the free market is again prevented from reaching the equilibrium point, from clearing the market, from equating demand and supply. Now we have a permanent shortage, a permanent excess demand over supply. We have demand being permanently greater than supply in the case of maximum price control, and supply permanently greater than demand in case of minimum price control. So we have, in other words, a chronic, miserable, permanent shortage. People are clamoring to get Cadillacs. The government says Cadillacs are now $500. You can't sell them for more than that. Where are they? Boy, I want my Cadillac. I want the $5 Cadillac. Ain't got them. Sorry, not there today, and so forth and so on. There's a sudden disappearance of the Cadillac. So prices are nice and cheap, but you can't find anything to buy the stuff at the cheap price. And we'll see what happens with that. And then you have this chronic, as I say, shortage problem. Okay, the famous example of permanent minimum price control, which apparently is just this year going to be eliminated. I don't really believe it. I mean, I'll believe it when I see it, put it that way. The famous case is there is also a case of the minimum wage law, but we'll get to wages a little later. It's very similar. The famous case is, of course, the American, all other farm programs, the farm price support program. The farm price support program began, well, first of all, the story starts with really with World War I. During and before and during World War I, the American farmer had the biggest bonanza in his history, because he was in a situation where European countries were blockading each other, and then they were at war with each other, so they didn't buy from each other. So all the European countries turned to an American farmer to buy the wheat and the cotton and so forth. So there was an enormous increase in demand for American agriculture. So the American farmer had the biggest fun time, the biggest boom time of his life in this period. And since then, of course, when the World War I was over, the European countries started selling and trading with each other again, and the farm prices collapsed. The big farm bonanza was over. So ever since then, ever since 1919, the American farmer has been trying to force the rest of us to go back to the good old days, which is called parity. It's a nice name for it. Go back to the good old days when he has the same price relationship. In other words, farm prices are the same proportion, same relationship to other prices, non-farm prices, as they were in the good old days of 1914. And of course, this is an absurd and idiotic demand because, economic conditions are not the same as they were then. You don't have this peculiar wartime boom. And also, the chronic situation with farms in general is, obviously we start with a world, in 1789, almost everybody was a farmer. I mean, either everybody was a farmer or they were selling farm products. So you had 95% of the population as farmers. Then as the world progresses and industry comes in, and services come in and all the rest of it, people leave the farm and go to the big city, Sin City, and do other things. And so we now have a situation where 5% of Americans are farmers, something like 5%. Well, I suppose in a sense it's too bad if you're an agricultural romantic, which I'm not. So if you're an agricultural romantic, you could pine for the good old days of the old days of the yeoman, the sturdy yeoman. But are you willing to pay the price for this? The price largely being smashing all the production that's been going on for the last 150 years, and going back to the production conditions of the old farm, where I'm afraid most of the public would die out because we're now geared to a population. The population and our economic level, a standard of living is geared to a highly industrialized world, not a world of the old sturdy yeoman farmer. So the farmers tend to die out. And what usually happens is not so much that the old Ezra, leaves the farm at the age of 60. It's his sons and daughters growing up, leave the farm and go to the big city, and that's the usual process by which labor migration takes place. So you can't freeze this. You can't say, we got to have as many farmers as we had in 1910 and all the rest of it. However, this has been the farmer's great dream, to restore the world with the golden age of parity. Well, finally, in 1928, Herbert Hoover, one of the most disastrous of our presidents, was elected and pledged to enact the Farm Block Program of Farm Price Support, which he promptly did. Important thing here is that he was enacted before the Depression. Most historians get this little blurred, and they tend to think that the Farm Price Support Program was a response to the Great Depression. It wasn't. It was enacted in March or February 29 or April, and the Depression came in October. So there was no hint of it. I mean, this was a boom, but the farmers wanted there. They wanted to restore the good old days. So we have the farm price support, which Hoover starts off, especially in wheat and cotton. Wheat has always been the big one, and cotton too, because that has the most political clout. So the federal government established grain stabilization corporations and other things. It's headed by the Federal Farm Board. Established the Federal Farm Board to buy up wheat and cotton and keep it off the market. And, increasing the demand curve artificially for wheat and cotton, this raises prices, all right? That's the theory. You raise the demand curve. Well, what happened there was, presumably to the desired level, the parity level. Well, they found out there was a problem. Incidentally, who was responsible for this farm block program, farm price support program, has been responsible ever since. Two groups at the beginning of the third group I'll tell you about. One is the large farmers, and I'll go back to that in a minute, because the small farmers, the thing has always been a push, the farms program has been pushed as have to help out the poor farmers. The poor farmers are suffering there in Iowa, have to help them out. Actually, the poor farmers have nothing to do with this program, get very little out of it. It's the large farmers get a lot out of it, number one. And number two, the farm equipment manufacturers, the manufacturers of combines, tractors, and all the rest of it, who, as we'll see why they're especially subsidized by subsidizing the large farmer. And the origins of the farm block program, farm price support, begins in 1921 with George Peake and General Hugh Johnson, both of whom were chairman of the board and president of the Moline Plow Company, the second biggest farm equipment manufacturer. And then the first head of the Federal Farm Board, 1929, was Alexander Legge, who was the chairman of the board of the International Harvester, which is the major farm equipment manufacturing. So it's the farm equipment manufacturers that usually don't get talked about in this connection, plus the large farmers. Get back to that. So anyway, so they raise the demand curve for wheat and cotton. They're buying it up like mad. But there's a problem here. The problem is that the market, being fairly intelligent, realizes they're sitting there. The Federal Farm Board is sitting there. There's an enormous amount of wheat and cotton. They're scared they might sell it someday, and the whole market will collapse. So this sort of Damocles was hanging over the cotton and wheat market. And as a result, nothing ever happened. The price kept falling. And then the depression comes, the price is falling even more. So that didn't work. It began to dawn on organized farmdom and on the farm block. There's only one way in which government can raise the price. They got to buy the wheat and cotton up and so forth and keep it somewhere off the market. And they have to start doing something about restricting production. In other words, because of the unsold surplus that's piling up, which they realize is piling up, we got to do something to cut production, cut the supply curve down, say, to point A. Well, they've been trying that for a long time, ever since. It hasn't really worked. First they tried guess what? Voluntary methods. This was typical Herbert Hoover flim-flam. Herbert Hoover specialized in doing things which were really coercive and on the guise of being voluntary. So he sent his people out to stump, the Secretary of Agriculture, etc., to stump the country, telling all the farmers, look, here's the situation. He didn't use these terms. That's essentially what he said. You got an inelastic demand curve for wheat. I mean, the demand curve for each farmer is almost horizontal. But for wheat in general, it's inelastic. So if all you guys get together and cut production by 10% or 20% or whatever, and slaughter every fourth pig and that sort of stuff, you will raise the price and all of you will benefit. You'll share a much higher income. In other words, a classic cartel situation. We'll get to cartels later too, but anyway, it's obvious how that happens. And so they're stumping the country and all the farmers saying, yeah, great, right, Hacha, we understand this. Let's all cut production by 20%. And then you see what would happen is old Ezra would go back to his, back home after this meeting and say, hey, Ma, those fools over there, they're all cutting production by 20%. Let's double our production and take advantage of the higher price. So while these other jerks are out there cutting their production and causing the price of wheat or cotton to go up, we're going to double ours and, as they take advantage of it. So each farmer thought the same way, and the result was a collapse of the voluntary program. Production went up instead of down. So, and then they started by the end of the Hoover administration, the farm holiday movement started vigilante activities where they were trying to burn the tobacco, the night riders in tobacco country, going around burning the tobacco of those farmers who refused to go along with the tobacco cutting. And they dumped the milk. They did that just a few years ago too, a milk strike where they dump other people's milk. In other words, private violence and private criminality as opposed to the usual government criminality. Now that didn't work either. It's a big country and there's a lot of farmers, a lot of tobacco, a lot of milk. So that didn't work. So there's only one thing left, that was the turn of the government to force the farmers to cut production. So enter the New Deal. By this time, Roosevelt enters the picture. But the thing is, by that time, the Hoover administration was willing to go along with this. It was not that the Hoover people. It was sort of a logical step. The next logical step, well, voluntarism doesn't work. We have to turn to coercion. So FDR, of course, is very willing to turn to coercion. And then we have the next phase 2 of the program, the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, headed up essentially by farm equipment manufacturers and people of that sort, the farm bloc in general. And so they try to introduce, so surpluses were piling up. It's always a big problem. First of all, it's an embarrassment, right? I mean, here's the depression. People are starving in the cities, and out there on the farms, the government's piling, in the warehouses, piling up all this wheat, all this hogs and pork and wheat and cotton. And it's rotting away. And what are you going to do with it? It looks bad. And so the fact that it's in the extreme left, I think correctly coined the term poverty in the midst of plenty. The fact that here you have all this, the government's piling over all this wheat and cotton and meat and all that stuff that's not being used, and here the people in the cities are starving. There's something wrong with the system. Well, you're darn right there was something wrong with the system. It wasn't capitalism, it was the government, obviously. So then the next step was to introduce coercive controls on production, limit production. Well, the thing is, they couldn't exactly, there are too many farms, they couldn't say, okay, from now on, there's only a certain number of bushels that wheat can be produced, and you produce, 1% of that. They couldn't introduce production controls in old Ezra because they just didn't have the manpower to enforce it. I mean, how can you control how many bushels of wheat old Ezra is producing? It's almost impossible. You have to have a vast 10 million man Gestapo going to each farm and checking up. So the only practical way which they could do it was to impose acreage controls, because it's easy for the county agricultural agent to go around in the car and see how many acres old Ezra has under the plow, how many acres is devoted to wheat, how many acres is devoted to fallow, and all that. So the New Deal imposes acreage control, which we still have, by the way. Well, we still have up until this year. Imposes acreage controls, and they sit back and say, okay, now this is gonna limit it. Now we're gonna push the supply curve over to point A, and everything will be hotsy-totsy. And of course, in this program, this sort of program, the consumers, the average American, suffers two ways. One, he suffers because all the food that's kept off the market, the wheat and the cotton and the meat and so forth, is kept off the market. He suffers from a restriction of supply, and the price goes up. So he suffers as a consumer, and then he suffers as a taxpayer, because the taxpayer has to pay for this. He has to pay, the government taxes him in order to pay get the money to buy the wheat and the cotton and the meat and store it somewhere and have it rot. So it's a double burden on the average American. So who suffered from this program? The average American. Who benefited from it? Well, in the first place, the small farmer, which was always the person held up as a beneficiary, didn't really benefit. One of the subsidy the government paid was per pound and per bushel. So if you had to really be a large wheat farmer or a large cotton farmer, planter, to really benefit from this. And as a matter of fact, with the acreage control coming in, and limiting acres, cutting down the number of acres the farmer can have under cultivation, the result of that was, what do the farmers do? What was the response to this? Very shrewd. Okay, I have 1,000 acres and they're making me cut out 200. Here's what I'm going to do. I'll take the 200 acres of rocky land, which doesn't produce anything anyway, concentrate all my efforts on the best land, the best 800, and mechanize and put in more fertilizer and stuff, and then raise production anyway, which is what they did. So they cut out the land and they raised production they wound up with more production than they had before, and surpluses kept piling up. This was incidentally helped by the federal government. Here's an interesting example of political science at work. The Department of Agriculture paying farmers not to grow wheat, and paying them handsomely to take the wheat and put it in store in useless warehouses, paying them not to grow wheat. At the same time, another wing of the Department of Agriculture down the hall is paying farmers a lot of money to improve their fertilizers, to mechanize, and to irrigate the dry land, and so they can grow more wheat. Now, you might consider this as irrational. So you look at it from the point of view of the consumer, but from the point of view of pure logic, it's irrational. Because why is the Department of Agriculture, on the one hand, paying the farmers to grow more wheat, on the other hand, paying them to grow less wheat? Seems pretty crazy, right? That's not crazy, however, from the point of view of two groups of people. One, the bureaucrats in the Department of Agriculture. They're doing great. You need two divisions where there were no divisions before. And secondly, it's not so crazy from the point of view of the farmer. He's raking it in, he's getting paid for more wheat and less wheat. So the farmer, however, who benefits was really the large farmer, because as the farmers contracted the acreage and mechanized, they kicked off their land, the sharecroppers, the small farmers, the tenant farmers, who now become, you see, a stumbling block, an obstacle in this drive to concentrate and mechanize. So what you have then is The result of this was the famous sharecropping problem in the South, particularly Negro sharecroppers, Negro tenants in the South, as a result of which we had an enormous immigration of Southern Negro sharecroppers who are now unemployed, disemployed, kicked off the land, and coming north to the cities. So a large part of the famous Negro migration in the 30s is directly caused by this New Deal farm program, which is supposed to benefit the small farmers. Actually, did just the reverse. Well, eventually, as we get to the 50s, what the farmers are doing is, okay, we take the land out of wheat and cotton, we'll put it into something else, put it into soybeans, lettuce, whatever it happens to be, corn. And as they do that, the supply curve of lettuce, corn, and soybeans increases and the price falls. Another headache. What do we do about the soybean price going down? So then in the Eisenhower administration, we had the brilliant idea of the so-called soil bank. It's a great phrase, the soil bank. It rings with thrift and, and all that, and the Protestant virtues. Actually, what it meant was the government was paying the farmers to, all right, take the land out of wheat and keep it out of anything. Don't grow anything on it. It's called the soil bank. So that's what they did. They got paid for not producing wheat, got paid for not producing cotton, and so forth. Senator Eastland, for many years, as a large cotton planter in Mississippi, reaped a handsome fortune out of the cotton price support program, which he was instrumental in keeping on the books. So, another group of people, incidentally, I mentioned the farm equipment manufacturers and large cotton and wheat farmers. Another group very interested in perpetuating the farm price support program, a group which is not usually mentioned, are the warehouse operators. The government's got all this wheat and cotton they don't know what to do with. They naturally use it. They rent it from private warehouses. And it's because of guaranteed demand. I mean, it's there forever. So if you're a warehouse operator, you're in great shape. You have this federal government always renting out your space. And so the warehouse operators, the grain elevator men, in the case of wheat, are one of the big lobbyists for the continuing the farm price program. As I say, the result of this, of course, to keep farm prices up. And when we had the 1971, the phases coming in, the present price control program, we had an interesting situation where farm prices and food prices were both under minimum and under maximum price control. What happened was that even when phase one came in, remember, everything was frozen. But of course, the food prices on the farm were exempt. Processed food prices were not exempt from the freeze. So you have a situation where food prices on the farm, which of course are always sacrosanct, are allowed to keep going up. Processed food prices are frozen, and of course you see what's going to happen very quickly to processed food. It's going to start disappearing. So this was that's basically the farm price support program. One of the results of this, and this ties in a lot of other stuff, is was the famous wheat deal with Soviet Russia. The wheat deal, which is one of the big things, gave a great impetus to the 1973 food price boom, food price inflation, whatever you want to call it. The wheat deal was consummated in the summer of 1972. The United States sold the Soviet Union, I put sold in quotes, sold the Soviet Union 440 million bushels of wheat, amounting to 30% of the average annual wheat crop, almost 1/3. Well, since Russia didn't have the money to pay for this, presumably, the U.S. taxpayer kicked in $750 million to pay for this. Incidentally, this is typical of foreign aid. Here you see the essence of the foreign aid program. The essence of the foreign aid program is the American taxpayer gets socked a lot of money. The money goes to the American government. The American government takes out a handling charge for operating the program, bureaucrat salaries, ships the money to some foreign government. The foreign government then takes the money and uses it on American export products, either automobiles or computers or wheat or whatever, cotton or whatever. The result of this, and they of course take out their handling charge, the foreign government. The result of all this process is that the American taxpayer has subsidized the American export industry with partial subsidies going along the way for their handling costs of the American government and the foreign government. So this is what happens here. Let's say the taxpayer pays for this process. The beginning of this, of course, kicks off an enormous increase in the price of wheat. The supply drops by 1/3, and There's also an enormous increase after that in the price of livestock, because the livestock eat the wheat as a part of the feed grain, so there's a restriction in the supply curve of livestock pushes to the left. And farmers start killing the cattle at a very young age and that sort of stuff and getting rid of them. The result of this whole process was a big food price boom. There are other causes of it, but that was the major one in 73. But the thing is, the reason why we did the program to begin with is undoubtedly the wheat surpluses which were piling up, and boy oh boy, because you have these surpluses, I say they're an embarrassment. And so the American government's attitude to the surpluses all this time since 1933 has been, let's get rid of them some way. How do we get rid of them? We'll dump them, give it away, or sell it, or get the taxpayers, or whatever, anything to get the stuff off the warehouse and get the other more wheat into the warehouse. There were other causes of the food price boom, and that was basically, I think, the major one. There was other, let's say, sort of temporary things. There was a sharp decline in the Peruvian fish meal production just about the same time. The anchovies left the Peruvian coast for some obscure reason, something, as far as I know, is figured out, and so forth. That also caused a drop in animal feed, but that was the basic. Also, another one is something which we'll get to later. The fall of the value of the dollar, the famous devaluation of the dollar on the foreign exchange market, leading to American exports becoming cheaper and therefore stimulating exports of all sorts of stuff, including wheat. Well, okay, that's the minimum price control program. And there's also the maximum price control program, which is more beloved. I mean, there's a lot of minimum price control here and there, but the maximum price control program is the way to really go all out. Let's say what it sets up is a shortage, and there's several reactions to the shortage. First place, if the demand is greater than the supply, it means let's say there's a shortage. How do you allocate whatever shortage is available, whatever the scarce supply, so to speak, available? Well, the various ways of allocating. Usually in the free market, it's allocated by the price system. Here there are other ways to allocate it. You see there's less produced now. There's even less than there was in equilibrium. Various ways come up of doing it. One, there's favoritism, the classic method. During World War II, as I say, which now becomes very relevant, when we had meat rationing, there was a big meat shortage. Always a big meat shortage. It was always blamed on the war effort. And people swallowed this until the war was over and there was still a meat shortage, and then began to get edgy. So there's a big price controls on meat were way below equilibrium free market price. And so favoritism is one way of allocating it. In other words, for example, during World War II, if you had an old neighborhood butcher, this is of course before the days of the impersonal supermarket. You had neighborhood butchers. You had an old neighborhood butcher, and you knew the old neighborhood butcher from the old days, and you were a good customer of his. Then he graciously allowed you, under the counter, the hot meat, so to speak. I got a good beef down here, and don't show it to anybody, and for you, Mrs. So-and-so, I'll give you this meat, sell you the meat. So that's one way, favoritism. If you had a butcher who was your brother-in-law, it's still better, and you had an unlimited meat supply. Get a hold of that. Relatives, friends in the butcher business, and so forth. So favoritism is one classic method of allocating scarce resource. And incidentally, one of the consequences of price control, we'll see later when we get to rent control, also follows. One of the consequences of this is racial and religious discrimination is aggravated by rent price control. Because what you're doing here is, instead of the consumer being king, instead of the supplier courting the consumer, advertising, market research and all the rest of it, now, see, when you have a permanent shortage due to the price control, now the seller is in the driver's seat, and the consumer has to go begging to the seller, please sell me some meat, and so forth. And then you see, with the seller in the driver's seat, he doesn't have to court the consumer anymore. He can tell the consumer to go to hell. And then his favoritism will come in. Okay, I'll only sell meat, one to my relatives, two to the racial or religious group whom I'm in favor of, because now he can allocate it. So a room for producer control of the situation now comes into the picture. So favoritism is a big one way of rationing. Another way is queuing up. Another classic method. Lining up. The line comes into the picture, and we'll see that as rationing comes. We'll see the lovable line process syndrome. You line up, all right? There's during World War II, for example, there was cigarette rationing. The cigarette showed up, I think, every Tuesday morning or something like that. And everybody was allocated only one pack per person or whatever. At any rate, the line formed around the block around 4 in the morning, and then by 8 in the morning or something, and if you happen to be in the first third of the line or whatever, you could buy cigarettes. So the great institution of the line comes into the picture. It's one way of rationing. Well, that means the first guy who gets to the line, who has the patience, who has the energy, has the stamina to stay there all night, can buy the meat or buy the gasoline, whatever it happens to be. The other people are out of luck. The little old lady has to hobble up, or somebody's on the night shift who wasn't in great shape, but others lose out. The little old lady who can't stand up for a long time can't buy anything in this process. The little lady has had it. So what you have is a different allocation of, instead of allocating by monetary demand, you now allocate by who can get to the head of the line first. There are processes in the old days, for example, the Metropolitan Opera used to have, keep their, for various reasons, both I think internal or legal ordinances, used to keep their price of their ticket way below the free market price. As a result, it's almost impossible to get a ticket. And one of these things, there's a person in this audience tonight who used to spend all the Saturday nights online waiting for the ticket office to open so you get the Metropolitan ticket. This sort of phenomenon, this is no longer true because now the price has been up to more or less the free market level. But this sort of phenomenon, lining up, queuing up, is always a phenomenon, always an attribute of government activity, government price control, because it comes into the picture as a form of rationing. Allocation, well, favoritism also comes in, by the way. Allocation, who's going to get this? So the government rationing comes into the picture. Who are they going to decide is going to get it? We'll get back to that. Government favoritism. Another process is hidden, I should say, decline in quality. Because the decline in quality is very, very difficult to police. It's not too difficult to police a price. You have the OPA, the old OPA, or the current IRS forces the grocery stores, the supermarkets to post their price. The price is such and such. But to check up on quality is an extremely difficult task. It means you need a multi-million-man Gestapo of experts in the field. Then you have to have a super Gestapo to check up on the experts aren't being bribed. So it's a fantastic, the implication is fantastic. For example, when Phase 1 came on, Phase 1 was the famous freeze. Everything was frozen supposedly for 3 months. And nothing was supposed to change. It was supposed to be there, sitting on everything. Well, the first thing that happened, the first people to break the freeze, by declines in quality, were the heroic ice cream manufacturers in New York City. I tip my hat to them. I, for example, happen to be a fan of Caramel Almond Crunch ice cream. There are 2 brands which I shall not name, 2 conspicuous brands who make them. In both cases, about a month after the price freeze came into the picture and the quality could be adjusted, suddenly there wasn't any almonds in the Caramel Almond Crunch ice cream. Where's the almond? There'd be like 1 almond per quart to satisfy the technical requirement. But the almonds tend to disappear. Now who's going to check? How are you going to have a Gestapo checking up on them? How many almonds have you got there? The candy bars begin to have more air in them, if you notice. Those of your candy bar fans. Where's the Baby Ruth where is it? So you subtly lower the size of the product. False bottoms began to appear in various lotion bottles and things of that sort. So you have a new improved lotion bottle, but it turns out it's less ounces because the Framus is under the false bottom. So all that sort of, and then another group that broke the freeze was heroic repairmen of New York. The painters and the repairmen. We began to find, for example, the landlords would call painters in to paint a room, and the painters would charge much more, 10%, 20%, 30% more than they did in July, before the freeze, and they say, hey, you can't do this, this is a price freeze. And the painters say, yeah, sure, but this is a different room because the plaster is over the Framus and the thing is, it's much tougher. So it's a different quality job. Who can check up on it? How do you know whether, you have to be an expert painter, obviously, to figure out whether the plaster is really over the Framus. If you're an expert painter, you're in the painters union, you're stalking the public. So, and the heroic repairmen, the TV and radio repairmen, you take the TV or radio to be repaired, and they charge you, considerably more than before the freeze. And you say, hey, wait a minute, this is a freeze. They say, yeah, but this time the condenser is wrapped around the tube there and so forth. So it's a much tougher job, and it's different and all that. And so in this way, the service industry pioneered in breaking the price freeze through this declines in quality. It's almost impossible to enforce it, and so you begin to have the sort of situation where the relationships begin to change from the so-called freeze setup. And also, finally, of course, is the black market. The black market is the market. It's the market popping up again. It's the hot meat. It's when you say, there's a meat shortage, you can't find meat, but, if you're willing to pay, etc., considerably more, don't tell anybody, here's the meat. So the black market shows up. Now, think about there's several things about a black market, even as lovable as it is. First of all, the sort of people who engage in the black market entrepreneurs are not the same people as the free market entrepreneurs, because people are more attuned to illegal activity. And so the quality of the product has to be a little shaky sometimes. You can't really be sure as you are with, the brand name. Second of all, they can't advertise. They can't take a full-page ad in the Times and say hot meat available. So they have to go through sort of shady channels, and it's costly, and the consumer can't find out. You have to be the sort of person who knows where the hot items are located, and most of the public don't know this, so they're sort of excluded from the black market. Thirdly, there's a heavy cost involved, not only because there's no advertising, but also because they have to pay off the cops. And payment of the cops, adds on, and cuts the supply, raises the price. So you wind up with something like this. If you take a vertical line up from the intersection point of the maximum price control point and the say point C and the supply curve, and have a vertical line up from it, you'll see more or less what the black market price will be. You hit the demand curve at the black market price. So the black market price is considerably higher than the free market price. And again, so the public is misled, and they say, "Well, gee, we can't eliminate price control because then the item will go all the way up, will skyrocket." Well, it wouldn't skyrocket that much because the black market price, for these various reasons, is considerably higher than the free market price. All right, so you have the black market, and I say the black market only is really patronized by people who know about these things, so it sort of cuts out a lot of the public. There's considerable black market activity during World War II, as patriotic as the war effort was. So there was this illegal activity going on. One of the things that happens when you have, the way price control was finally eliminated in World War II, it had hundreds of thousands of OPA people enforcing this stuff, enforcing price control. Even our beloved president got his start in life in the tire rationing division of OPA. Might be certain symbolism there. At any rate, so there were hundreds of thousands of people working on this thing, enforcing the regulations and so forth. Even so, there were lots of black markets. And after the war was over, they eliminated some of the price controls, but because the clamor went up, the shortages still remain. And then they said, well, you couldn't blame it on the war effort. Well, there was particularly a meat shortage, a big beef shortage, as there was this year for a short time. The big meat shortage. I mean, it's just impossible to find meat. One of the things I should mention here, price controls in general, before I get to that, is that usually price controls are enforced at the equilibrium point. The idea is, well, prices are going up too much, we have to freeze them as they are. This is what happened on August 15, 1971. You try to freeze prices. Well, the thing that happens is that the next day, when people wake up on August 16th, it seems like nothing has changed. There's no problem, no shortages, all you guys are alarmists, because the next day, the equilibrium price on August 16th is not much different from the equilibrium price on August 15th. So for a little while, for a short period of time, it looks as if the price controls are working. The public has a mistaken sense of euphoria at the whole thing. Then what begins to happen is as the time goes on, there's an increasing discrepancy between the official price, the fixed price control, and the free market price, which keeps changing. It can either go up or go down. Usually in an inflationary period, of course, the free market price keeps going up, because the demand curve keeps going up as more money is poured into the system by the government, and so you have a sort of a secular increase in demand curves. And as the demand curve keeps going up over time, the shortage starts developing, it gets worse and worse. So it means that after the price control is in action for a few weeks, a few months, a year or something, the whole thing begins to fall apart. More and more shortages develop, more and more black markets. In other words, the more the price control continues in force, the worse things get. So by the end of World War II, the public had it, and say the excuse of the war was now over. And so by 1946, there was a fantastic meat shortage. Meat was just could not be found, to the point where insulin couldn't be found for diabetics and so forth. So President Truman, the clamor came out, let's eliminate price controls, including meat controls. And an enormous hysteria came up. For example, the New York Post, I remember very vividly, for those who are not New Yorkers, a highly liberal paper, was hysterical about, you must not repeal OPA. If you repeal OPA, prices will quadruple, quintuple, go up 200-fold, etc. There's a fantastic fear of freedom developed. What would happen? You can't eliminate price control. It's part of the American heritage, and then prices would, the gouging entrepreneurs would charge infinite prices and so forth. Even the local disc jockey at the time, the late Martin Bloch, who was the preeminent disc jockey of his period, was never involved in politics at all, suddenly came on the air, I remember this vividly personally, and pleaded with everybody to write letters to your congressman to keep OPA because otherwise prices would go through the roof. Even disc jockeys were becoming economic pundits at the time. Well, so Truman was faced with the following choice, this is the choices which he reported to the public. He said, well, there was no meat to be found. What are you going to do about it? Well, he said he was faced with a choice of mobilizing the National Guard, drafting and sending the troops, calling the troops out, and nationalizing the meat industry, going out into the farms. He said, well, he thought of confiscating the meat packers. That would have been easy, but he said he admitted that wouldn't make much point because the meat packers didn't have any meat either. And Swift and Ormer said they didn't have any meat. They couldn't nationalize them. So he said, well, I would have had to go mobilize the troops and nationalize all the farms, go out there and nationalize the ranches and livestock farms and drag the cattle out. And he said he gave serious thought to this. He said, well, he figured it was impractical. Fortunately for the American public, fortunately for freedom, it was election year, 1946, congressional election year. The Democrats were in grave trouble. You can imagine what would happen on the farm vote if suddenly soldiers with fixed bayonets had come in and seized the cattle. So with great reluctance, President Truman reported, well, because it was impractical and probably the public wouldn't have liked it too much, I hereby give up this whole term. I hereby eliminate price controls on meat. And within a week, the whole meat shortage was over, only to reappear, of course, this year when price controls came back again. So one would have thought that was a lesson for the government, but for economists, but I guess memory is fairly short in this whole area. One of the things about when price controls break down, when the shortages increase, when there are black markets, the temptation of government. See, government is faced, as my late mentor, Professor von Mises, would say, all government intervention in the market creates extra problems. It doesn't solve anything. It finally creates some more problems, and then the government has to intervene more or else give up the whole business. So Truman was faced with this sort of crunch. Either send the troops out and nationalize the farmers, or draft the farmers or something like that, or give the whole thing up, eliminate the whole control regulation, which is what the government hates to do. So usually the temptation is to escalate enforcement. The penalties are only 10 years in jail, and make it 30 years. Execute them, kill them, torture them. You think I kid you on this, but in other climes and other cultures, which do not have the American reluctance to inflict this sort of punishment, all stops were pulled out. The famous case, for example, is the Emperor Diocletian, the late Roman Empire, who was inflating like mad. I'll get to the causes of inflation later on, but he was inflating the currency by clipping coins. That was the ancient primitive method of doing it. And so prices kept going up, but finally Emperor Diocletian issued his decree freezing everything. All right, from now on, the so-and-so is 3 drachmas and such is 2 denarii and all that. He had a completely, very detailed list. He even had things like writing of the first quality 5 denarii, writing of the second quality 3 denarii. Who decided how, the quality of the writing is an interesting point. At any rate, he had the whole detailed list, and he made no bones about it. He wasn't limited by any American Civil Liberties Union or the Fifth Amendment. He said anybody who disobeys this regulation, death, immediate capital punishment. And he killed a lot of people, but it didn't work. Even the death penalty could not hold back the tide of black markets, and the price controls finally fell apart and so forth, and he had to give it up. He just said, okay, the heck with it. That was the emperor. That was the first big example of price control. Unfortunately, that was not heeded very well either. We all know about the guillotine of the French Revolution, when the Jacobins were killing a lot of people, aristocrats. But we don't know what isn't focused in on is probably a majority of these killings were killing not of aristocrats and Tories and Bourbons, but poor merchants were violating the price control regulations. The government was inflating like mad, this time paper money. They had the law of the maximum price control regulations on food, etc. And there was a shortage of food in the cities due to this, and then the regions were starving and rioting and all that. And of course, who gets blamed? The poor merchants. First the mobs loot the stores of the merchants, get rid of all the food, and then what? And that's the next step. Then you in those days you guillotine the merchants for violating the price control regulations, engaging in black market activities. So when the Jacobins tried the guillotine, that didn't work very well either. The more recent example of escalated enforcement, the old pal Chiang Kai-shek in China. One of the reasons for the so-called loss of China is again something which only economists seem to know about, is that Chiang Kai-shek was engaging in very severe inflation of the money supply, pumping in money like mad, and prices were engaged in a runaway escalation upward. And as if that were not bad enough, Chiang then imposed very severe price control. No, we have to freeze prices at such and such a level. And then it didn't work, and they had black markets, and price controls were being disobeyed, so he escalated the enforcement. The result of this was the food didn't get to the urban areas, and the urban areas were starving, and the peasants couldn't get manufactured goods and so forth, and the whole thing, the economic process was breaking down. And then Chiang kept escalating the punishment. Finally, he decided to shoot the merchants in the public square of Shanghai, and he shoot all black marketeers and line them up as a public example. Well, that tore it. That was about it, because the merchants, the last support of the Chiang Kai-shek regime, then figured, communists aren't going to be worse than this. The guy's shooting us. Also, the communists were quite shrewd on this, and when they took over an area, they stopped inflating the money supply, and the inflation problem was licked. So this is one of the key reasons for the Chinese loss of confidence, and Chiang's credibility, as we call it now. And that was he had it. As a matter of fact, using this insight, I forget now when it was about 3-4 years ago, I think, when Marshal Key was then the head of South Vietnam, started shooting merchants in the square of Saigon for disobeying the price control regulations. I figured that was it. He'd had it. That was the end of the Vietnam caper, because he was following almost classically the route that Chiang Kai-shek had followed. So escalation. So even if we're going to wind up enforcing the gas rationing with immediate death on sight, it's not going to help the situation. It's not going to help enforce the situation. Another interesting story about price control is that Hitler, of course, had price control during World War II, because Hitler was one of the follow the modern economic science. And when the American forces of occupation came in and occupied Germany, the American theoreticians, the idea at the time, the so-called Morgenthau plan, was to deindustrialize Germany, to punish Germany by turning Germany back to a pastoral country. So, as a method of doing this, as a conscious method of deindustrializing Germany and turning it back to a pastoral society, we imposed severe price controls. It was the same economists and theoreticians who were in favor of price controls in the United States in order, quote, to save capitalism, unquote, were doing the same thing in Germany in order to crush it, to smash Germany forevermore. So they imposed severe price control. They try to roll prices back to 1939 level. And of course, prices going way up. The free market prices going way up since then. The result of this was the following. I guess you all know the stories. I don't know. Maybe I'm the only one old enough to remember them. the stories about buying girls with candy bars, that sort of stuff in Germany. Well, because the Germans were starving. The reason why the Germans were starving is not because the German industrial machine had collapsed. It was because all the stuff that had been produced before the war, in other words, before 1939, was the price controls were way, way below the free market price. You had to suffer severe financial losses to produce them. As a result, the Germans didn't produce any food, didn't make any candy bars, didn't make any clothing or any of the necessaries. Instead of that, they shifted their resources, producing goods which were new, and which therefore were not under any price control regulation. Because the price control regulation usually has a historical base. You freeze it as of August 15th or whatever it is, or freeze it as of 1939. Well, if it's a new product, wasn't around on August 15th, or wasn't around in 1939, how do you set the price for it? So as a result, the new products were free of price control, and so the Germans were producing toys like mad, all sorts of new toys, hula hoops, whatever, instead of producing food, clothing, shelter, etc. So in 1948, after 2-3 years of this horror, finally sanity won out, largely through the influence of a couple of students of Professor von Mises, as a matter of fact. And they said, look, the only way you can ever solve the German economic situation is repeal the price control, and which they did. And very shortly after that, the whole shortage was over. Girls were no longer available for candy bars, and you had the so-called economic miracle of West Germany following shortly after that. So once again, price controls were the villain, but here the interesting sidelight is that we did it consciously to crush the German economic system. Okay, when phase one came in, as I said, there was the reaction of the caramel almond crunch and the servicemen, etc. The price controls obviously have not worked very well. That's pretty clear. Phase one, everybody sort of hailed it, terrific, fantastic, beautiful, strong president, all the rest of the malarkey. And then after a while, things began to happen. So the freeze wasn't working so well. We went over to phase two, which was sort of a moderate control program. You allow certain increases. Again, of course, it's politically allowed. And then what happened was, for example, in phase two, is that you have things like this. Well, the government would allow a business to raise its price if it was making low profits. If, on the other hand, it was making high profits, you force them to lower the price. So what began to happen with phase two is that firms began to look around desperately for ways not to make profits. It's easy not to make profits. You just sort of let her rip. And Business Week would report it. Business Week, incidentally, I recommend it not for its position, but as a news magazine, not for its ideological views. Business Week reported, well, firms would do some things like this. First of all, the old expense account come rolling back. Live it up, Jim, because, we don't want to make too much high profits. So go to the pavilion or whatever, and Hilton's, etc. Don't go first class on planes, etc. Also, businesses started having their annual meetings in the Bahamas instead of in New York. And as one executive said, well, if we have to be inefficient, we may as well enjoy it. So that sort of attitude comes in. Of course, this means the system begins to crack. And phase three then comes in, which was a little bit better, and then phase four, then phase 3.5, freezing everything again with the control, after the inflation of food prices, and then the severe freeze coming in 1973, at a time when the economy is booming, and there's a scarcity anyway, and as a result of which we suddenly have a beef shortage, can't find any beef, suddenly a gasoline shortage. And then we go into phase four, which is slightly better than phase 3.5, but not as good as phase three, and whatever. So we're still in a situation where there's heavy price controls throughout the system. One of the ways in which a shortage, which say always appears when the price control is held for a while underneath the equilibrium point. One of the ways of allocating this scarcity is government rationing, which of course we're now beginning to see with gasoline, etc. Rationing sets in its own interesting system, which again we saw in World War II. Rationing is very peculiar kind of. In the first place, it means that you have a second money. I mean, it's bizarre just from that point of view. Instead of just having money, I mean, usually if you want to buy something, here's the price. You know what the price is. If you have the money, you buy it. If you're willing to spend the money, or if you don't buy it. Now, in addition to having the money in there, you also have to have ration tickets. So the ration ticket becomes a sort of a second, a parallel money. Also, the ration ticket means that the government is allocating the resources by its own favoritism, by political favoritism. You and your, for example, during World War II, the big thing was to be an essential war worker. If you were an essential war worker, engaged in essential war work, then you get vast amount of ration tickets. If, on the other hand, you're a poor schlep with nothing much to do with the war effort, you starve or whatever. For example, on the gasoline front, there was several kinds of ration tickets. Everybody was supposed to share equally, suffer equally. It's always the slogan of the rationers. Well, in World War II, people suffered unequally because there were several degrees of ration tickets. The average citizen had an A ration ticket, which entitled him very little gasoline. As a matter of fact, by the way, this is a point of mild interest. The government highway thing, the speed limit enforced during World War II was 35 miles an hour. We might see that again, who knows. But at any rate, the A ticket was just a few gallons a week was allowed to the person. And then there was a B, and the C was the sort of munificent, and the X ticket was unlimited. In the first place, the congressman, over 200 congressmen asked for and received from the OPA the X brand, in other words, unlimited gasoline for congressmen. Absolutely, boy, they were obviously engaged in essential war work. So top priority. Second of all, you had things like the truckers had unlimited amounts for the T ticket, and the truckers began to sell their excess T tickets to other people. You began to have leakages. This is Henry Hazlitt's great novel. This great economic political novel called The Great Idea. It's now called Time Will Run Back. It has a whole story about, it starts with a communist system of the future and winds up with a free market by logical deduction. And the first thing that happens is some brain in the communist system says, hey, why don't we allow people to exchange their ration tickets? It's a sort of a big new thing. Why don't we allow the people who don't smoke cigarettes to sell their cigarette tickets to the guys that don't eat anchovies or something, and then sell the anchovy ticket. And then both people will be better off. And they start with that, and after several chapters, you wind up with a free market. Interesting thing is, of course, the government didn't allow anybody to exchange their ration tickets. I predict, of course, when they come to the gasoline ration, you won't be able to exchange your gasoline ticket. If each person's allowed 20 gallons a week or something, and you don't drive your car, you're not allowed to sell your 18 gallons to somebody else who will drive more. So, because that would benefit both people, the exchange would be the market. The ugly head of the market would suddenly rise up again. We got to clamp down on it. So, as a result of this, you had truckers illegally selling their surplus T tickets. You have things like the C people. You have things like C tickets were given to let's say the Sharpies would get the C tickets. In other words, the average Joe would have his A ticket and they only have a few gallons a week. The Sharpies had their almost munificent C tickets. And the Times or the News would print pictures from what signs on Aqueduct parking lot filled with C tickets. This caused a lot of class envy or resentment. Then you have things like, literally, OPA enforcement agents went out and checked up. You weren't supposed to drive, get a C ticket, say. You're supposed to only drive. You were only supposed to stop at a gas station, a certain amount. You were only supposed to walk 10 feet beyond the gas station and no more. And you literally had spies, OPA spies, going around checking up on, you're parked near a theater. That means you're going to the theater. If you have a C ticket, you're not allowed to go to the theater, and they clamp down on you, arrest you, take your C ticket away, tear up your C ticket in front of you, and that sort of stuff. That was literally going on. There's an interesting book by Richard Lingman called There's a War On, which talks about what was going on. It's not an analytical book, but I think tells these stories of what actually happened. Well, one of the things that happened was this ration ticket system. Well, first of all, I would say just on ration ticket, I think the whole thing is absolutely monstrous. It's totalitarian. It's despotic. Nobody should have a right to tell anybody else how many things to buy, how many lights to turn on, what heat he's supposed to have his room at, and all the rest of it. So it's totalitarian, monstrous, whatever. Any value judgment you can think of, I'll go along with on that. Well, one of the things that happened was a heroic mafia came into the picture in World War II to relieve, leading the people's struggle, against gas rationing. And they counterfeited an enormous number of seat tickets. It was easy to counterfeit seat tickets, and so it was estimated that 15% of all the gasoline sold in America was sold at counterfeit seat tickets, and 30% in New York. So these things are things to remember as rationing falls in on us. There's also the my wife's sweet old grandma, when she died, it was a source of embarrassment to the family to find out that she had in her basement an enormous amount of sugar. This is the great people's revolutionary movement of sugar hoarding during the war. We were told never buy sugar because somehow our boys rely on you not buying it. Well, let's go into the. I think there's time to go into the energy crisis and exactly how the energy crisis. First of all, if there is to the extent that there is an energy shortage, obviously the solution to it, there will not be a shortage if you allow the price to go up. If you allow the price to go up, this will ration the existing amount to those who will ration it voluntarily to those who will willingly want to spend more on it, those who consider it more important, and so forth. So you have a smooth form of voluntary rationing where, as I say, those who are most interested in buying the gasoline or the heating oil will buy it. But secondly, by allowing the price to go up, you'll stimulate more supply after a while. More wells, marginal wells will come in, oil wells will come into production. Distribution will be speeded up, etc. So, by allowing the price to rise, even if there's a scarce supply, the supply curve is going to the left. By allowing a free pricing system, by allowing the price to go up, it will do two things. One, you will voluntarily ration, so the consumers, in accordance with who is most interested in most important use, to buy the material for most important use, will voluntarily ration themselves in accordance with a higher price, and also this will stimulate an increase in supply. So the least you will allow, there won't be any more shortages, there won't be any more black markets, there won't be any more need for rationing, and so forth. That's the first thing to do. The second thing to remember also, as going on the energy crisis, the government, by various methods, has created it, has restricted supply and increased demand artificially. And so the thing to do, of course, is eliminate that. On the oil caper, it starts with the oil proration laws. Oil proration laws began in America in approximately 1931-32, when enormous oil fields were discovered, vast and superabundant oil fields were discovered in Texas and Oklahoma, the great Texas-Oklahoma find, as a result of which the price of crude oil plummeted straight down. The oil industry got rather hysterical about this and called upon the state for bail them out. This is known as a partnership now of government and industry. Not all oil men, but enough oil men to count. So the classic cartel situation comes into practice. The first thing the government did is they outlawed all further production of oil until we can straighten the whole thing out. They called it an oil moratorium. And to enforce the moratorium, the governors of Texas and Oklahoma declared martial law and set the troops out into the oil fields. Especially because at night, you see a lot of the guys were wildcatting, drilling their own oil and taking the hot oil out. And so they came in with fixed bayonets and guns at the ready to shoot any wildcat oil driller who was drilling his own oil, getting out of the ground and shipping it out. They did shoot some people. The governor of Oklahoma was the colorful Alfalfa Bill Murray, Wild Bill, Alfalfa Bill Murray. So there was an oil moratorium that straightened it, stop production. First thing to do, stop that. And then the states and the federal government collaborating set up oil proration laws. The oil proration law works something as follows. In Texas, for example, which is the largest oil state, there's a old geezer, usually a retired general, who's the head of something called the Texas Railroad Commission. As far as I know, it has nothing to do with railroads. It's only involved in setting maximum oil quotas. So every month the old geezer decides how much oil is allowed to be produced next month, and he said, okay, from now on, next month, you can only produce whatever, million barrels of crude oil. And then each oil well in Texas has a quota, like, you're 0.005% of the oil in Texas, and then you're restricted to that. So in other words, the supply curve of oil is pushed drastically to the left. The price of crude oil is raised. This, of course, pushes the supply of gasoline and heating oil, all the stuff that comes out of crude, to the left and raises their price. This has been going on since 1932, and every month the old geezer puts out this maximum quota. And the excuse for this, for an economist, the excuse for this is laughable. They'll say, well, we need the Texas Railroad Commission to do this because they have to adjust supply to demand. That's what the market's supposed to be doing, adjusting supply to demand. No, they need this because otherwise what? Otherwise too much will be produced. And the price of crude oil will fall, and we can't have any of that. So that's the first chronic thing, a very basic chronic thing that raises the price of crude oil and limits the production. Now this has been done in the name of conservation. I'll get to that as a conservation caper later on. But it's done in the name of conservation. Well, we want less to be produced because then the future generations will have it, all that jazz. However, along with the oil proration laws came oil import restrictions. Keep foreign oil out. If you're really interested in conserving American oil, keeping all that oil in Texas, then you want to encourage the importation of foreign oil like mad, right? Right. However, they did not. They kept out foreign oil, thereby shifting the supply curve of oil to the left, starting with tariffs, winding up with oil import quotas. So in order to import oil, you have to buy somebody else's quota right. So in other words, if Shell Oil had 10% of the imports in 1950-something, whenever this thing came in, if you're a new oil importer, you can't import oil. You haven't got the right. It's illegal. You have to buy the 10% or the 2% from Shell at a high price. This, of course, keeps out competitors and keeps the oil imports from coming in. This, I think, has been repealed about a year ago. But the point is, this has been the basic policy for quite a while. So this, that's the restriction on domestic and foreign oil. And then, in addition to that, the federal government of the United States is sitting on an enormous amount of oil. Enormous! It's been sitting on it for 50 years now, and nothing has been done with it. This is called conservation or something. It's called withholding from the market, thereby raising the price. There's the Elk Hills Reserve, I think in California, which has God knows how many billions and billions of barrels. And there's the Teapot Dome, which, of course, is a famous case in American history, where the poor guy was crucified because he wanted to at least get the oil out. Sure, he might have been a crook, but at least he was trying to produce some oil. Well, finally, President Nixon's latest speech, he's going to start producing a little bit from the Elk Hills Reserve. But the point is, it's been kept off the market all this time, thereby raising the price of crude oil and the price of gasoline and the whole business and restricting the supply. Then in addition to this, and this goes for all the shortages, I haven't got time to go to the other products yet. There are the environmentalists, crazies, as I like to call them, who have now stopped with absolute determination and will, have tried to plug the gap and try to restrict production anywhere they can get their hands on. So as a result of this, oil refineries can't be produced for several years because God knows why. They pollute the air, or they deface the landscape, whatever. So this is cut down on the production of oil refineries. Also, of course, the Alaskan pipeline, which would supply about 2 million barrels a day, which is pretty hefty, has been held up for many years because of the environmentalists. They're finally getting going, but it's been held up for many, many years. As far as I can make out the Alaskan caper, I've done some reading on the Alaskan question. The environmentalist problem seems to be twofold. One is to deface the landscape. In other words, the beautiful, unmarked by man, that is, plateau and steppes and whatever they got up there in Alaska would be defaced by the fact that there'd be a pipeline running through it. It's really tough. And I noticed the logical implication of this. And if the conservationists, the environmentalists had been in control in 1776, we'd never have anything beyond, a little fort here on the tip of Manhattan. Because you couldn't chop down a tree, you couldn't do anything. So that's one problem, the scenic problem, which is something that's not, I do not find a grabber, let's put it that way. And the second problem is the caribou. The caribou like to walk across the tundra. And if you have a pipeline, which has to be dug down deep because there's a thermal whatever, heat in the soil, then the poor caribou wouldn't be able to walk across and be confused. They die out. I swear, that's then the oil company said, okay, we'll build a ramp, we'll get bridges across the pipeline so the caribou can walk. But then they said, well, yeah, but the environmentalists said, who knows? I mean, maybe the caribou wouldn't like the bridge, they like the tundra, they wouldn't walk across it. And for this, we have to suffer and not have any gas rationing. The Alaskans themselves are rather annoyed at this whole thing. The editor of the Anchorage Daily Times wrote a letter and said that of the 300,000 people in Alaska, at least 299,000 are very bitter about this holding up the Alaskan pipeline. And the other people, he said, the other 1,000, quote, feel a kinship with all the kooks who want to lock up Alaska as some sort of permanent wilderness. It's pretty clear that people in Alaska don't want to live in a permanent tundra. Okay, so that's the oil caper. Then a very related sort of thing is for example, the crippling of natural gas and coal. Natural gas is a substitute for oil and heating, etc. Well, natural gas for the last 25 years, for an obscure reason, at least obscure to me, has been regulated, the price of which has been regulated at the wellhead and interstate commerce by the Federal Power Commission, way, way below the free market level. Of course, as inflation proceeds, it's even further below. Now, why it's been done that way, whether it's been done for ideological reasons or because the gas buyers want it, I don't know, or a combination. But at any rate, this has created an increasing shortage over the years of natural gas, especially in interstate commerce. There's plenty of natural gas in Texas itself, in Oklahoma, because there's no price control intrastate. The result of this, there's lots of natural gas reserves. Everybody knows there's lots of natural gas under the ground, but nobody's looking for it because it doesn't pay anybody to look for it because the prices are held way below the free market. As a result, there's an increasing natural gas shortage. As the natural gas shortage, people turn to oil. So you have a cut in the supply of natural gas, an increase in the price of oil, increase in demand for oil artificially, which adds to the oil problem. And created a fuel oil, the heating oil shortage, I should say, for last year, and it will continue. So natural gas is crippled. When natural gas is artificially crippled by the government, this raises the demand for oil, and this adds to the oil shortage. Same thing happened to coal. Coal has been crippled in many ways. There's lots of coal around, too. Lots of coal. Coal has been crippled in several directions. First place, John L. Lewis, the beloved leader of the coal union for many years, was a very good economist. He understood exactly what was going on. He knew that if unions pushed up wage rates, it would cause unemployment. He knew that very well. He was a brilliant economist. On the other hand, he was in favor of it. Since he was in the union and his comrades were union members for a long time, he said, okay, we'll disemploy them. I mean, how about them? They're not union members, they're apprentices or whatever. As a result of which you have and he did this in collaboration with a lot of the large mine owners who wanted to disemplloy their smaller competitors. As a result of which you have a deliberate policy of a mine workers union for many years, since the 30s, to cripple the coal industry, to shift the supply curve to the left, to raise the wage rates for those remaining, those oldsters still in the coal business. Everybody else is in Appalachia living as hillbillies or dropouts, forced dropouts in Appalachia. Well, this cuts a lot of the coal supply. That's one factor. Second factor is the environmentalist crazy is back again in two directions. One is hysteria over strip mining. Now, strip mining is quite cheap. It's 40% of the domestic coal mine is strip mining. Now, there is a problem with private property of the farmer down the hill in strip mining, but the basic I think charge seems to be aesthetic. The strip mining causes an ugly landscape. The hill is grooved forever, or whatever it is. Again, this is not the sort of thing problem I find a grabber. I think it's more important to have coal, oil, fuel for the cities and factories than there is to worry about the Kentucky hillside. At any rate, the strip mining hysteria caused lots of laws to be passed to restrict strip mining, cripple it, and so forth. And the second environmentalist thrust there was the air pollution. Dirty coal is a dirty fuel. Sulfur is poured into the air and so forth. And then the Clean Air Act of 1970 Federal Clean Air Act drastically lowered the supply of coal, which means people have to shift to oil for heat, which raises the demand for oil, and again you have intensify the oil shortage. Now I'm not really in favor of air pollution. I don't know much about it. I think the public media has been one-sided in the fact that we've only heard the environmentalist side of the story. The anti-environmentalists claim that the sulfur really disappears pretty quickly and doesn't really harm anybody, but at any rate, certainly the restrictions came on awfully fast, let's put it that way, and awfully suddenly, and awfully severely, and again causing these effects. So coal has been crippled, natural gas has been crippled by government action, and also electric power. Electric power been crippled. First of all, utilities can't build nuclear power plants because people are worried about nuclear radiation, etc., although the experts claim there's no real problem. Secondly, they can't, for example, Con Edison has been trying to build a Storm King plant for God knows how many years up the Hudson. The environmentalists have stopped it because it ruins the Hudson. The Storm King mountain view is spoiled. Again, it's not something it's not an argument to which I feel I can do full justice. So this has stopped the Storm King plant for many years. Presumably they'll finally get it, but it's held the thing up a lot. Cuts down supply of electricity, raises the price, etc. Increases the energy shortage. And finally, there's the whole problem of electrical utilities anyway. Electric utilities are compulsory monopolies. You can't compete with Con Ed. Con Ed has a monopoly. Each electrical industry firm in its area has a monopoly granted to it by the government of its area. You can't go into competition. You have a compulsory monopoly. And secondly, you have a fixed rate of return guaranteed, fixed rate of profit guaranteed by the government. So the rate is set by the government action. Fixed pleasant rate of profit is set. Not very high. On the other hand, it's guaranteed. So this makes a big difference. So it means there's no competition in the electrical industry. It means there's research and development and all sorts of technological improvements in the electrical industry is cut out, is eliminated, it's restricted. And also, the way the rate is set is a fixed rate on return of capital. In other words, let's say 6%. So this means that the rate is set in such a way you get a certain profit per amount of capital. This means the higher your capital, the better off you are, regardless of whether the capital is any good or not. As a result of this, the electrical industry has hardly ever depreciates its equipment. It depreciates equipment very, very slowly. Because why do it? If you have your $10,000 machine, which is half dead, so to speak, doesn't make any difference. It's worth $8,000 on the books, and you get your profit rate determined on that basis. The result of which is that while IBM, for example, a very progressive company, depreciates its equipment very fast, say in 10 years, AT&T and Con Ed depreciate their equipment over 50 years. Hang on to their obsolete equipment until the last possible ounce is squeezed out of it, thereby again repressing and restricting and crippling technological developments and improvements and productivity in the utility industry in general. Well, that of course adds to the energy shortage. Well, as we have political rationing, as I say, we'll see congressmen voting themselves the unlimited supply of gasoline and so forth. We're also already seeing rationing of airline flights, which is a beautiful cartel arrangement where the government, the CAB, Civil Aeronautics Board, tells the airlines, got to cut out your airline flights. And the airlines, of course, receive this dread information with enormous enthusiasm. Since they've been competing, even though their competition is fairly limited, as we'll get to later on, by the CAB, by the existence of the CAB, still they were competing, and they found out that not every flight was like a cattle car, and there was even some empty seats. And so we're now, boy oh boy, we're patriotically going along, we're cutting out half our flights, and every plane will be packed. So once again, you have the government as cartelists, restricting airlines' competition, service, etc. But we'll get more to the airlines and the cartel thing later. I'd like to wind up this homily on price control and rationing. A little quote, if I can find it. From a column of a journalist who There's not this, let's put it this way, he's not distinguished as an analyst, or as a knowledgeable on the market, but he's got a great spirit, especially in relation to the government. This is Pete Hamill's column on Monday, New York Post. Just a few lines from it. He's reacting viscerally, instinctively, I think correctly, to the government blackout, the energy, the gas rationing, all the rest of it. He says, now they've even taken away our skyline. It had been hours since that day in 1945 when we all raced to the rooftops of Brooklyn to see those million lights blink on again, dazzling, joyous, triumphant, and unbelievably beautiful, signaling to us that the war was over. I remember a woman crying on the rooftop that time, knowing that the long night of the Second World War was finished, that New York was blazing again with its electric beauty, the blackouts and dim outs were behind us, that the troop ships would soon be home, the New York skyline, ours forever. And now it's gone again. Moving along the city's highways, there's a joyless sense of defeat and loss in the town. It's as if the malignant hand of Richard Nixon had reached out from the bunker in Camp David and pulled the light switch on all of us, spreading his personal darkness. The Empire State Building is a blinking red light in the dark. A great pile of downtown buildings, Truman Capote's diamond iceberg, is a hole in the night sky. And by the end of this thing, he says, we are overdue for a rebellion against the corrupt criminal government in Washington. And now we have one opportunity to make that rebellion overt. Turn on all your lights. Drive 65 miles an hour. Will Rockefeller order airstrikes on the thruway to stop us? Refuse to turn down thermostats. Let Washington know we've made them again for liars, and let's get back our skyline. There's a lot of shortages instead of just the energy shortage. Incidentally, on the energy, footnote on the energy shortage, the latest thing is that they're planning to outlaw, not just have gasoline rationing, but they're planning to outlaw Sunday pleasure driving. And we're getting back to the World War II thing, the horror stories I was telling you last week about OPA spies checking up at and see if you're parked near a movie, which would imply that you were on a pleasure trip. Well, it's the same sort of thing. How are they going to enforce this? If they try to enforce outlawing pleasure driving, there's going to be a vast Gestapo wandering around making sure every car on Sunday is really going back and forth to a hospital, and everything else is going to be clamped down on. And then they figure, well, maybe it'd be easier to enforce it by just simply closing down all the filling stations. So you won't be able to get gas on Sunday. So I suppose it's a cute trick. On the other hand, what happens to the so-called essential driving then? If you're traveling 100 miles to the hospital in an emergency, you run out of gas and gasoline has been outlawed. Well, I guess it's just too bad. Instead of allowing the price system to ration the so-called scarce material. So we're getting more and more to that sort of situation. There are other shortages too. There are several shortages I might mention now. There's steel. Steel suffered from steel was surplus. Only a few years ago there was a big so-called surplus of steel. A few years before that there was a so-called shortage. So things happened obviously very rapidly in the steel business. What happened with the steel industry is that there were severe Phase 4 price ceilings. That's the current price ceilings. There have been severe Phase 2 and 3.5 also. The result of all of which was that the price of steel has been held way below the free market price, and as a result you have a steel shortage. The Cost of Living Council, for example, in its wisdom, refused to grant a price increase because the excuse was, the profits were high. If you look at the profit ratio, you say, hey, the profits are pretty high, especially compared to 1969-70 when there was a recession. The profits have increased quite a bit. Then you say, well, we don't allow the price increase, not realizing, of course, that the whole point of prices moving up and down is not to allow a rate of profit, but to allocate supply and demand in accordance with our market clearing, no shortage, no surplus setup. As a matter of fact, the thing that just happened today, November the 20th. Today there was a latest issue of Human Events has come out. There's a long report of a speech by C. Jackson Grayson and C. Grayson Jackson. I always mix that up. Who only a short couple of years ago, was the head of our august price control program. He's come out in a blistering attack on all price and wage controls, saying it won't work, it causes shortages, causes hidden upgrading of workers, all the sort of stuff I've been telling you here. So, unfortunately, all these guys get great when they're out of power. When they're in power, they're so hot. The same thing happened some years ago
only the older citizens here will remember this. There was a gentleman who was the head of the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, named T. Coleman Andrews from Virginia. After he retired from the IRS, he stumped the country from then on attacking income taxes, going for the repeal of the income tax amendment. So, let's say, out of power. I guess they learned from experience or something. There's also a great statement that I found from the Executive Vice President of American Standard Incorporated, a certain Bryce Durant, who said, quote, "As long as we have price controls, it's hard to assess the true price and availability of alternative materials. It's like playing with cards when you can't read the numbers on them." Good summation of what happens when there's no price system, no freely fluctuating price system to allocate resources. That was the steel problem. Also, of course, there's a big shortage in paper. Really big. My brother-in-law happens to be a printer in the South, and he has enough paper only because he stored up a lot of paper. He squirreled away a lot of paper over the last 6 months or a year because he saw a paper shortage emerging. The problem, why is there a paper shortage? Well, for several reasons. One of the biggest factors, again, price controls. What happens again, you see, when the phase 1, 2, 3, and 3.5, etc., came in at a time during a recession when profits were low and so forth, and then the prices were then frozen in at the very low profit margins, and then profits go up, and the government says that's a terrible thing. Profits have now increased. We won't allow you to increase prices, and so we're stuck with a paper price way below the free market, and this generates a famous paper shortage. There's no shortage, by the way, in lumber and plywood, only in the paper part of the industry. What happened in lumber and plywood is a healthy falling off of residential mortgages because of the building crunch in 1973. So that's and the interest rate going up. So the shortages are a function again of the price control setup. Again, not exactly creating a shortage, but causing paper to be much less plentiful supply, declining supply. Again, we have very, very heavily in the picture the environmental crazies, whom I mentioned last week, who, because paper is certainly probably the most polluting of all industries, and so there's a massive closing up of paper mills. All the old paper mills in Wisconsin and other areas, New England, etc., were shut down, and of course that led to a dropping off, a shift to the left of the supply curve for paper, which of course created more of a shortage if you have, because of the free market price then became even higher. I thought of a bon mot in a speech I gave last week on price controls, which I may as well use here also, which is that explaining the difference between scarcity and shortage, between a shift of the supply curve to the left and a shortage, which means you can't get anything regardless at the existing price. Rembrandts, for example, are very, very scarce. Nobody ever talks about a Rembrandt shortage. I mean, if you want to buy a Rembrandt, they're always available for the $2 million or whatever you want to kick in for it. The point is, even though very, very scarce and not likely to increase in supply, nobody worries. There's no griping about a Rembrandt shortage because you pay the free market price, which balances supply and demand. Also, there's a cement shortage. Which, again, the two things involved, and again, we have almost a litany here. You know what the two things are. One is price controls, imposed during a period of recession, locked in with a very low rate of return, and so forth, and preventing new plants from being built, new cement plants. And secondly, environmentalists who are worrying about the pollution caused by cement plants, leading to a closing down of a lot of the old cement plants and decreasing the supply. So we're also, of course, another thing is the final sort of icing of the cake is the cement factories tend to use a lot of natural gas as fuel, and there's a big natural gas shortage caused by the government's price regulation, so forth. There's all things. One thing about the market is everything impinges on everything else. All right. I come now to a couple of special areas of price control, which, apart from the current disaster. There are certain areas of price control which have been going on for many years, and where we have shortages sort of almost as a permanent fact of life in America, and almost accepted as such. because people really, we've gotten to this point, don't know any better. There is, for example, in New York City, we have a special, it blazed the path on a special permanent shortage, which most of the public doesn't know about in America, and that's an apartment shortage. You can't find apartments very easily, if at all. The apartment shortage in Manhattan, the chronic apartment shortage, has been going on since about approximately 1940, came in, not coincidentally, with the rent control law, which was passed at the same time. New York City is one of the few cities in America that has rent control. I think there are a few others that, in a benighted fashion, just put it in again last year. But in all the other cities in the country and removed it at the end of World War II, we kept it, continued on with it. The result of rent control, again, is during an inflationary period, so the demand curve keeps going up and the free market rents keep going up. The government then decrees the rents shall remain the same, let's say, as it has been before. This means over the years, as the demand curve keeps going up because of inflation, and the rent is frozen at the old rate, the gap between demand and supply keeps increasing. The apartment shortage, in other words, the shortage of apartment space, which is what's being sold on the rent market, keeps increasing and being aggravated. Well, what happened was that before, I like to tell a story. This is a story which I tell my kids, which I'm sure is not going to be repeated in our lifetime. I told my students the story about the queuing up behind the butcher's shop, and I'm pretty sure that is going to be repeated. But the other story, I'm afraid, is not going to be repeated. And that's the story of New York City in the golden age before 1940, when everybody moved every year. I mean, it's an incredible situation. Every year there was a one-year lease, and October the 1st, for some reason, the lease was up. And Ma, where are we moving this year? Well, I think we'll move 3 blocks down and 2 blocks over. And it was a magnificent and beautiful thing. There were vacancies all over the place, at every income level and every size apartment. It was just great, just terrific. And people moved every year. And so every October the 1st, the moving vans, the whole streets were clogged with moving vans, moving from one apartment to the other. Immediately, bingo, comes the rent control law, and bingo, the disappearance of the great October 1st moving fest. Nobody moves anymore. I mean, it's a very, very rare event. And the knowledge of this, has disappeared from New York life. And of course, the excuse given by the establishment was, well, of course, there's a apartment shortage because population is going up. Well, first place, population did not suddenly go up on November 1st, 1940, or whatever the date was passed. And second place, population in New York City is not going up. It's remained about the same for about 20 or 30 years, the same 7.x million, whatever it is. It's really remained remarkably constant. So again, we see the old control devil at work. What happened was that after 1947, I think it was, and there are other people much more expert in this area than I am here tonight. What happens is that the politicians in their wisdom look around, they find out there's no new houses being built, no new apartment houses. Hey, this is kind of a peculiar thing. During the 20s and 30s, lots of apartment houses are being built. How come here we are in a big post-World War II boom? There ain't no houses being built. And it dawned on them that maybe there's some relationship between heavy rent control and the big holding the rents below the free market rate and the fact that no new houses are being built. It is, by the way, much easier to get across to the public the idea that price control will cause a drop of future supply. That's not too difficult to get over. The really difficult thing to get over is that even given the supply, price control below the market price causes shortages and misallocations. So that's much more difficult to get over. But the idea that no new stuff will be built is fairly easy to comprehend, apparently. So what happened is the administration at the time decided, here's what we'll do. We'll induce new housing to come in by having a free market in new houses, no rent control for new housing. Of course, there's no rent control at all for office buildings either, thus causing one of the biggest office building boom probably in the history of the world. The last 20 years, that everybody should turn to this 40-story monster. So we'll have free market for new apartment houses and keep the old rent control in the old apartment houses. So all of a sudden, the New York City housing market was split in two, was bifurcated, when markets are usually interconnected. So now we had the old housing market, we still have the big shortage going bigger and bigger for old apartment buildings. It means old apartment buildings built before 1947, and new apartment buildings with a free market. And the result of this was, since the people couldn't find the old apartments, this increased the demand curve. It's like substitutes. We now have two markets. This increased the demand curve for new houses, for new apartments. Just like shutting off natural gas and by putting a maximum price control on that, increased the demand curve for heating oil. So this means it's increased the demand curve for new apartments, and this increased the meant that the free market rent for the new apartments was much higher than it would have been without the rent control system. You have this huge gap. You have a situation where for example, an old 8-room apartment on West End Avenue was very sturdily built like a fortress with large rooms and so forth, would be going in something like $125 a month. On the other hand, a new building built in a rather jerry-built fashion on First Avenue or something. A 3-room apartment where you can hear the person down the hall turn the light switch. This goes for $500 a month, or something like that. You have this enormous and crazy disparities between rents because the demand was was channeled into these new apartments. And of course, then people think that, well, if we eliminate rent control in the old apartments, then the rents will skyrocket up to what it is in the new apartments, First Avenue or something. It's not true. What would happen would be a rise in the rents in the old apartments and a fall in the rents in the new apartments. There would be an equalization tendency towards. In other words, going back to the old one housing market, interconnected market before the split. What happened is, so this continued on. It's pegged along, and more or less in this fashion. Oh, by the way, one of the things that happened, one of the ways in which the housing shortages was manifest, an apartment shortage, is that you have things like queuing up, the equivalent of queuing up, favoritism, black market. All these things show up in New York City apartments. For example, queuing up, you go on the waiting list. For example, in the building in which I live, which happens to be one of these old wall buildings or old building types, if you want to move to a 7-room apartment, let's say, you have to go on a long waiting list, 3-year waiting list or something like that. The point is, what moves you up to the head of the waiting list? Well, the Lord knows. From the lap of the gods. If, however, you happen to be a brother-in-law of the landlord, or a friend of the landlord, or if a certain amount of money changes hands, either with the super or the landlord, the super then becomes sort of his own, he begins to allocate the property. Then you go up, you shoot up on the waiting list. This often tends to happen. You also have a situation where, well, for example, this happened in France, the famous juvenile study of rent control in France. The same sort of thing was happening here to a lesser extent. In France, everything was much more aggravated. You begin to haunt the funeral parlors and people turn into ghouls, in other words. For example, just as sort of an instance of this, a friend of mine who, how should we say, is sort of lacking in good taste and refinement anyway, called me up very excitedly one day, I think it was a Saturday afternoon or something like that, and said, hey, it's a fantastic thing, this old opera singer has died in an 8-room apartment on Broadway, because there's an article about her in the Times, and apparently she died, she lived in an 8-room apartment, and she wasn't married or anything, nobody else living there, and he's going to rush over in an hour and grab the apartment, buy the apartment from the super or whatever the transaction is going to be. So he rushed over there, as I say, not hampered by refinement. Rushed over there. He found out about 5 couples were ahead of him. He was way down the list. So ghoulishness, comes to the fore. You haunt who died, an hour ago, what apartment they have, and you rush over. And in Paris, apparently, has the regular systematic kind of thing where you not only put a super on or a landlord on a retainer, you put the funeral parlors on a retainer. So the funeral director, as the coffin comes in or the corpse comes in, check up, call you up, give you the quick call, tell you about the apartment. You just opened up. So this sort of rather unhealthy, I think we all agree, kind of system is generated by the rent control process. There's also, as I say, the black market, and one of the common customs on the west side of Manhattan, which is sort of the key probably the biggest gap in the country between the pre-market price and the rent control price. You put the super on a retainer. You go on various buildings, you put the super on a retainer and say, call me up and stuff. That's sort of very common practice. One of the things that happens is that the people get locked in. If you happen to be in this rent control apartment and the gap keeps increasing because of inflation, here you are, you're sort of locked in at something like serfdom. So what you have, typically in the west side of Manhattan, you have the following kind of scenario, as they say. A couple moving with 2 or 3 kids moves into an 8-room apartment in Central Park West, West End Avenue in the 1930s when the apartment was, I don't know, $85 a month. And then well, what happens is they decided, to complete the story, they decided to, the city decided, well, we can't leave the rents exactly at 1940 levels. It's a little too much, a little too blatant. So we'll allow a 15% increase every time somebody moves out and some other family moves in. You can imagine what happens then, the economic analysis of that. Then you have a fantastic class struggle is initiated between the landlords trying to get the tenant out and another tenant in because 15% rise every time you do that, and the tenant tries to stay in. So this, instead of the landlord courting the tenant and trying to get more tenants in or trying to keep the tenant there when he is in and painting and all that and improving the amenities of the place, the landlord's trying to get the old tenant out, improve the amenities for the new tenant, and then get the new tenant out, and constant reshuffle, so you can get somewhere up to the free market price. But anyway, in the situation of the couple with three kids, moving in the 1930s at $85 a month, so the rent goes up a little bit, but the couple stays in. They're locked in. The children grow up and move away. The husband dies, and you have a little old widow, an 8-room apartment paying $120 a month. The free market rate is something like $500. So and the thing is, the widow can't move because if she moved any other apartment, say in a new building, available apartment would be like 1 room for $300 a month, or something like that. So the little old lady is locked in. You have this fantastic, what's known as space hoarding, so to speak. Certainly not her fault. I mean, I think that's the situation. Whereas younger couples getting married or new people coming in from out of town have to go to the Park Avenue, the First Avenue apartment, and pay the $400 for the 2 rooms. So you have this tremendous misallocation of where a new family, just because they're newly arrived on the scene, get penalized, whereas an old family it's like serfdom. An old family got the seniority and you're there forever. Another thing that happens, another peculiar and bizarre thing here is that what the rent is purely depends on whether the person, how many times people have moved in and out. So you can have on the same house, the floor above and the floor below, you can have the same apartment, one going for $85 a month and the other going for $400, depending on how many times people have moved out. If you have the serfdom situation, the little old lady still hanging on, you have a very low price. The other hand, people have moved in and out a lot, you have a much, much higher price. Really insane kind of housing allocation. I mean, nobody can possibly defend this any kind of economic principle. So, again, of course, the result of rent control. What happened then was, in the late 60s, I think it was, I forget now, it was around the middle of the late 60s, the New York City government in its wisdom passed a new improved zoning law. The zoning laws are always designed to help the public give fresh air and grass and everything, all that sort of nonsense for the sweltering New York City masses. And each time, of course, they do that, they impose drastic restrictions on how much can be built. There have to be setbacks every few feet. As a result, this cuts down the supply of new houses. This, of course, is not taken into consideration, presumably, by the city planners. So, because if you could only build a building with almost all the lot, a very expensive lot taken up with grass or something, you might have beautifully grassy buildings. On the other hand, you might not have too many buildings at all as a result of this imposition. So anyway, so the real estate business was given several years grace and several years warning. The zoning law is going to go into effect in a few years. And so, of course, there was a fantastic rush to build buildings quickly, build new apartment buildings, to get in before the crazy zoning law comes in, when the whole housing market will be clobbered forevermore. So there's this big bulge, a sudden bulge in the mid-60s and supply curve to the right in new houses, new apartments. As a result, for the first and probably last time in the history of New York City, we had a fall in rents in new buildings. It was almost back to the golden age of the 1930s. Not quite, but it was sort of a trailing clouds of glory from the past. For example, during the 1930s, the way rents I mean, the way you cut rents, you don't start off by cutting rents, because that's pretty drastic. What you do is you offer concessions. In other words, you offer 1 month or 2 months or 3 months free rent for the person to move in and sign a 2 or 3 year lease. So this is a form of rent cut, but it's not a sort of an official form. You can retract the concession much more easily. You can jack the price up again. So they started offering, new buildings were offering concessions, rental concessions for the first time since the 1930s. It was a beautiful thing to watch. There are actually vacancies and signs, vacancy signs instead of the old under the table bribes, that sort of stuff. Well, of course, this was only a temporary bonanza, because then comes the zoning law, and bingo, the supply of new houses falls to almost zero, and that means the supply curve of new houses shifts to the left, and it very suddenly. And it's, in other words, a result of this zoning law kind of situation. So the result of this is that when the leases come up, 2-3 year leases come up for the post-1947 housing, all of a sudden the free market price is going way up. In other words, because of this bulge, and then bulge the other way after the zoning law went into effect. As a result of the new tenants, the new building tenants, were asked for a very hefty rent increase on the landlords, 50% in some cases, 30% or whatever. So hysteria then hit. And of course, the free market was blamed for this. You see, if you have a free market in houses, the landlords will gouge you and raise the rents infinitely and all that sort of thing. All sort of nonsense. You can't trust the market, and the new building tenants, many of whom were quite wealthy, of course. I mean, there's a sort of a knee-jerk response that tenants are always poor and landlords are always wealthy. So that's a lot of nonsense. There are lots of little old ladies who have like one apartment building, an apartment building with 2 families. They'll get small income out of it. And there are lots of very, very wealthy tenants. Nelson Rockefeller used to be a tenant before the Park Avenue building went co-op. So you don't have to really bleed for the tenant per se. So the tenants put enormous pressure on the city government to do something about this. And city government responding, put on rent control on new buildings for the first time since 1947. So now we have two different types of rent control. We have the old law rent control, the pre-47, the really rugged one, and you have a peculiar thing called rent stabilization for the new buildings, where you're allowed 15%, maximum 15% increase per year or something like that. So, of course, the result of this was to totally clobber new residential buildings. And who in blazes, if you're in the building construction business, who would build a residential building at all now, when you can just as easily build an office building and know that you're going to be free from rent control forevermore? In contrast. So, well, finally, in 1971, a little bit of sanity hit the housing situation when the famous Urstadt report was issued. The New York State Housing Commissioner, Charles Urstadt, who said, well, really the whole problem of apartment shortage in New York City is the rent control. And I guess he would have liked to have gotten rid of rent control altogether. That was politically impossible. So he pushed through the legislature the so-called vacancy control law, which vacancy decontrol law, which decontrols apartments as soon as they become empty. Of course, and continues the old price rent 15% or whatever, some other formula, continues the old severe rent control for if the tenant stays in there. Of course, this sets up a fantastic class struggle, because that means if you're able to kick the tenant out, the whole thing, you go up to the free market rent. If the tenant clings there for dear life, he stays there, he or she stays there at 40%, 50% below. So as a result, they pass all sorts of laws, special hotline, housing bureaus which stay open 24 hours a day or something, and make sure, call up whenever the landlord dumps garbage in your window, whatever it is. So, well, what happened, this has not really been tested very well, because as soon as the law was only into effect, the vacancy control law was only in effect for about 2 months when President Nixon passes his freeze. And then federal rent controls came in, and then everything got messed up. I'm not really sure what's going on. I think now, for the last 6 months or a year or so, the state vacancy decontrol law has been in use, in practice. I don't know the effect of it, except there's a lot of hysteria to eliminate it altogether and go back to the old rent control, which is essentially the current situation. So anyway, we've managed to have because of wartime, the rent shortage, of course, was blamed on wartime as well as population. The war has been over now. World War II has been over for, almost 30 years. And the emergency rent control still remains in force. And of course, the shortage remains in force. All right, there are other areas where, well, I mentioned France also. In passing, Bertrand de Jouvenel wrote an excellent little pamphlet on rent control in France, particularly in Paris. And he wrote it in 1948, and apparently the situation is more or less the same now. And he got the same sort of situation, except more severe, where rents remain not too much higher than they were in 1914, and prices are astronomically higher. And so people, a wealthy person, for example, might pay 1% of his income in rent, or $1 a month or something like that for rent. I mean, the whole thing, as a result of this, you can't rent any apartment at all. You buy an apartment, which incidentally is happening in West Side of Manhattan also, where you simply, the building goes co-op, in quotes, so that instead of renting an apartment, you have to buy it. The result of this gets completely out from under the rent control law. There's no price control on co-ops, on buying the whole apartment. So that means there's plenty of apartments available if you have the money to buy it. So here rent control originally is supposed to come in to help poor tenants, help out the poor tenant. Now we're getting more and more in a situation where the only time you can be a tenant, so to speak, is when you're not a tenant, when you got the scratch to buy the whole apartment. Which is a rather peculiar kind of reverse effect. At any rate, coming on to, and I should say also that in Europe, rent control is very severe. Scandinavian countries and France and Israel and so forth, as a result of which the apartment shortage is very severe. It's correspondingly severe. There are other areas where it's not quite as obvious, where price control does its work in causing shortages. For example, we've had a problem for quite a few years of airport congestion, particularly at peak hours. And here I commend your attention to an excellent pamphlet on called Airports and Congestion, something like that, by Ross Eckert, put out by the American Enterprise Institute. What happens is, so what you have is a shortage of airspace there on the airport. All right, so what's going on here? Why is there a shortage? Well, again, of course, we always look for government. In the case of airports are universally owned by municipal government. Apparently, it's become part of the American heritage that you can't have a private commercial airport. I understand that Pan Am, a friend of mine works for Pan Am, so Pan Am several years ago tried to get permission from New York City to build its own airport in the New York area, which would have relieved congestion, which would, etc., for its own planes, was denied as being evil, immoral, whatever. So the tradition is going up. You have to have government-controlled airport. Now, the government, as we'll see later, as we get the government in general, as they see what keeps sniping away at government throughout, and as we get along, we'll integrate it more and more. Government has no particular reason for maximizing profits. We'll try to get the maximizing profits today too, or operating efficiently or anything of that sort. Their pricing is, they price them whatever the way they want to for political reasons, because whatever happens, the taxpayer is going to pick up the tab if there are any deficits. There's no competition. So the way what happens is the airports have priced their services in a really bizarre way, which no private airport would ever do. The problem comes in the fact that the prices, the big shortage in the runways. And the problem comes in the fact that the price of the runway, in other words, the landing fee and the takeoff fee, is extraordinarily low. It's something like a $5 per landing. And it's equal for every plane that comes in, whether it's a 300-passenger airliner or a private plane zooming in with one person in it. And it's equal for the time of day. It doesn't matter whether it's rush hour or midnight. So the result of all this is that the demand for airport runways is much higher in the rush hour periods, and would be much higher. I mean, certainly Pan Am would be willing to pay a lot more than Joe Blow's private plane for a landing. The result of that is fantastically push the price of runways way, way below the free market price and cause congestion in these points. And it also means, and how do you ration shortages, this kind of shortage? You ration by queuing up, in this case. So queuing up, of course, in the airlines is stacking up. So the Pan Am circles for an hour, so the two private planes that happen to get there first. It's like a line. You can't reserve your space. Pan Am can't say, I'll reserve runway 5 Kennedy Airport at 5 o'clock. No, you take your chances. And if you get there, if it happens to be two private planes zooming in ahead of you, it's just tough luck. So this sort of, here we have a system of congestion being a shortage of space, brought about by this crazy pricing policy, keeping airport runways way below the market price. The Eckert pamphlet goes into a whole discussion of what happened, for example, when Kennedy Airport, I think, raised its price for its landing fees from something like $5 to something like $25. And really, $25 is pretty small too. But yet, just this little increase pushed out, enormously relieved congestion because it pushed out a lot of the private planes. It wouldn't pay. I mean, you think, after all, if a guy has a private plane, he's pretty rich. But still in all, that extra $20 was stuck in his craw, and they tended to shift from Kennedy Airport to the little airports in Westchester, etc., which was designed for private planes, which is supposed to handle these people. But of course, who wants to land in Westchester when you can land at Kennedy and nip into Manhattan very quickly? But that extra $20 was apparently a good incentive not to do that, to spend $5 to land in Westchester. So just that, and that with hardly a market-clearing price increase, but that itself was a point of the way. Also, of course, the idea of charging passengers, for example, higher fares in rush hours than in off hours, is an intelligent thing, and would help the problem too. However, the really guts of the thing is the runway caper, which is still way below the free market level. And what happens is that since Pan Am is much more willing to pay, say, $100 even than a single person pleasure of flying on Sunday or any other time, the pleasure flyer will go up to Westchester and have and take longer to come into the city. In the meantime, while they're doing this, the airports also have another peculiar pricing system. They give monopoly concessions to the concessionaires. The concessionaires then charge monopoly prices. So there's a whole study been done, for example, the price of a sandwich at an airport restaurant and a comparable restaurant very close by. If you get sort of and the airport sandwich is a much higher price, probably also poorer in quality, although it's difficult for a scholar to gauge. But so the point is, you have the monopoly concession. The concessionaire charges a monopoly price, and the concessionaire shares the monopoly gain with the airport. In other words, the airport is sort of like a kickback to the airport itself. And the airport expects to get most of its money to recoup, to break even or make money from the concessionaires. And whatever it fails to, whatever deficits it has in the concessionaire business, that's what it charges for the runways. Instead of charging a market clearing price for the runways, it simply charges as little as it can, what the customers have left over after they've been stocked for the crummy sandwiches. So, and the insurance, and there are all sorts of concessions in airports which are designed to charge monopoly prices. Again, if we have private airports, there's no reason why we can't have private airports, this sort of pricing system would not be going on. There's another, of course, very prominent form of shortage and congestion, even more prominent than the airports, and that's traffic congestion in big cities. Rush hour, New York City is getting to the point where any hour Manhattan is congested. What you have again is a shortage of shortage of street space. And of course, this is not unrelated to the fact that the owners of the streets, invariably and everywhere, are government. How does government price the streets? Well, they price them in a very irrational manner, put it that way. Not in a market clearing manner. If they did, there wouldn't be a constant congestion. The pricing, the government excuse is that that's all right. They're pricing by the user tax on gasoline. So the tax you pay per gallon of gasoline goes for the highways and all that sort of stuff. So it all balances out. Well, first place, it doesn't really balance out. But aside from that, the point is you're spending as much money then to drive. It costs you as much to drive around Upper Westchester at 3 a.m. as it does to drive around Midtown Manhattan at 5 p.m. So the fact that you're spending money per gallon doesn't really mean a darn thing. It's not a market clearing kind of price. No private street owner in his right mind would ever price in that manner. So what kind of pricing will they be? Well, obviously we can't predict in detail how the market will operate, but obviously be in a way to charge more money for congested streets than for non-congested streets, for outlying areas. There can be all sorts of devices to do this. There's various economists, by the way, even non-market economists have gotten interested in this area as sort of an intellectual game. How could this operate? Come up with interesting suggestions. One way is to have a special sticker, like a license. So instead of having just the regular license, you have the sticker on the window or whatever, which you have to pay for either per week or per month or per day, whatever, can be always adjusted, which would be very expensive and allow you to drive around the Midtown area from 4 to 6 or something like that. And the price will be charged in a market clearing manner. The same thing can be done for parking. The parking fees, of course, parking is again mostly handled by government, and street parking certainly. And parking fees are very peculiar. They're invariably way underpriced, way below the free market price. And as a result, there's a big parking space shortage. Plus the fact that they're priced in a peculiar way, so that very often they're priced in such a way that you're subsidized for spending more time there. In other words, if you park for 4 hours, it costs you less per hour than if you park for a half hour. Of course, if you want to have a high turnover and clear the market for parking, you should do just the opposite. You charge more for a longer period and try to induce the guy to get out so the new car can come in. The governments almost never do that. So what you would have, and the thing is, what the government does, and this is typical government activity, either they subsidize the parking so the price is zero in effect, almost virtually zero for street space, so you have tremendous congestion. And then, or they say, well, what we have to do, there's no getting around, we have to ban all cars from Manhattan, or from Midtown Manhattan, prohibit them, stop them, shoot anybody who comes in the 42nd Street. It's a typical government kind of activity, where either something is free, either you subsidize it so it's completely free, or else you prohibit it altogether. Obviously, what the market would do, if the market were allowed in this situation, is to gauge this thing and price it, and set the price in such a way as to clear the market, and everybody would be happy. There'd be no shortage of parking space. It'd be fairly expensive, perhaps, but that's the way it should be, since that would be allocating the scarce space for the intense demand. I don't know what the price, of course, would be, but it would be somewhere, it would be somewhere in between zero and being prohibited. So someday, if we ever get this kind of market pricing, if we ever get private streets, we will get market pricing. The funny thing is, most people think of the onus, if somebody advocates privately owned streets, that the assumption is that the government is operating streets so beautifully that the onus on proving that the market can handle it is on the person who advocates the market alternative. Seems to me it should be just the opposite. Certainly in New York City, the streets are miserable, dirty, littered, and congested, and difficult to see how any private street company can do any worse. So just on empirical grounds, one would think they would try it. So we should tend to look then at things, not just sort of obvious things like nails and cement, where shortages can be caused by price control, also in these sort of hidden areas where people don't think in terms of prices, such as airport space, such as traffic space, and so forth. We'll get later on, we'll get on to the question of conservation, go back to the whole thing about scarce capital and scarce natural resources, too. And also the whole question of private property in general in different hidden areas, so to speak, we'll get to later on. The whole things of private property areas where nobody thinks in terms of private property, such as radio, TV channels. We'll get to that later on. 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 We'll get to that